Welcome back to the final installation in the training series. This is Fearless Training Raw Knowledge Podcast with your hosts and physique coaches, Alex and Crystal.
Hey guys.
So today we're going to be wrapping this up with tempo. So if you've not already listened to, as ever, go back and listen to the other preceding episodes. This is meant to be watched and listened to sequentially. Otherwise, it's not going to make the most sense. So as a bit of a recap, we started on the training series with adherence, volume, frequency, and intensity, progression, exercise selection, rest periods we did last time, and now we're going to wrap up with tempo. So first things first, time under tension, TUT, the acronym. What are we talking about? So time under tension is the amount of tension that we're creating and the time that the muscle is under that tension. But we must understand two elements specifically, which is tension versus force, meaning that people go on about time under tension all the time. But the thing is, if the force or the load that is being created under that time is not great enough, therefore adaptation will not occur. I'm going to use a really simple example. I'm wearing a bracelet here. For those who are listening, it is very light. Now, if I do a bicep curl, and technically that is in that position or similar position where the weight would be doing a bicep curl, and I go really, really, really slow, right? Slow as I can over time, and I do 100 reps, maybe 1,000. Will I grow muscle? No, probably not. Why? Because the force based on gravity as well that this bracelet is imposing on my muscles is very low. It's not great enough. I can overcome this inertia very easily, where if you put a 10 kilo in my hand, I'm probably not going to be able to do as many. And then if we go 20 kilos, so on and so forth. So it's all relative. So time under tension is relative to the amount of tension we have, okay? But we certainly need time under tension to grow muscle. I'm going to talk about some specific sort of tempo allocations as well that we want to look at when we're doing our movements to produce as much muscle tissue and or strength as possible. Before we do that, we need to talk about the different parts of a movement, which is generally going to be an eccentric and a concentric phase. You might be familiar with those. The concentric is the shortening of the muscle. So for those watching, I'm doing a bicep curl. I'm coming up. As I'm shortening, I'm bringing my fist towards my shoulder. That is shortening the muscle. That's concentric. And as I'm lengthening out, that is eccentric, okay? The stretched versus the shortened position. We have isometric as well, which is same state. We're just holding it. But generally, we're talking about the two when we're weight training. So first thing that we need to understand is when we're in that lengthening phase, that is when we are stretching muscle, right? We're going to be doing that under tension, under load. That is where most of the damage, the metabolic damage, the damage in the muscle tissue is being caused. That is why we generally hear of let's slow down the eccentric, the lengthening, and let's speed up the shortening. We can argue that both of these parts of the movement are important, but the eccentric is more important. That does not mean that we neglect the concentric. It just means that we want to be a little bit slower on the eccentric and a little bit quicker or more powerful where possible on the concentric. But we've got to control both parts of the movement pattern. So you're very good at explaining tempos. Now that we've established that, talk to everyone about what tempo that we should be using and what are some different tempos and why that is important.
Yeah. Probably the first thing that I will say is that when you're reading tempo, so tempo is always either 3 or it's 4 numbers, right? And there's always like a dot or a comma, something in between. So it doesn't matter what exercise you are doing, how you read it is exactly the same. The thing with it that becomes quite confusing to people is that the first number always represents the lengthening phase. So as Alex was doing before, the bicep, so this is our lengthening phase. It's always going to be the biggest number as well when you're reading it. So that's a good dead giveaway, that the biggest number is how long you want to take in that position of length, okay? The thing that gets quite confusing is that there are multiple exercises where you don't start in the lengthening phase. Some you may start in the shortened phase. So when you're reading it, you actually have to jump to the third number, which is the shortening phase. So that's probably the biggest key takeaway first when you're starting to learn and understand tempo. So you've got your first number, which is your lengthening phase. Your second number is how long it's going to be in the stretched phase. The third number is always going to be the shortening phase. So this one's always quite a quick phase unless you're doing a constant tension throughout the whole movement, which we don't do too much of, especially in the early days and when you're getting into tempo. And then the fourth number is always the position held in the shortened phase. So that's probably the biggest way to read it. So if you were doing, let's just say, bicep curl, and if it was a 3-1, even just a 3-1-1-1, right? Because that's a big one that comes onto a lot of pretty standard, especially for isolation movements, right? So we're going 1, 2, 3, holding for 1 down the bottom, 1, bring it up, big squeeze at the top for 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, hold, 1, 2, 3. Another one is when a lot of the time in the shortened positions, there might, depending on what program you're following or what program you're reading, if it is another coach's program, it would probably be, there'd be a naught, so a 0 or a cross, which also means naught. So if we were doing the same exercise, but let's say 3, 1, 1, 0, which would be 3, 1, 2, 3, second, 1, up, 0, 1, 2, 3. So what that would look like is 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3. So it's just changing up the exercise to put the amount of tension throughout the exercise dependent on how it's wanting to be delivered.
And if you were listening to that, you're going to want to watch on YouTube because Crystal was demonstrating the whole time. If not, you'd be like, what, is this Morse code?
Yeah.
But it is important.
It actually reads like Morse code. You're like, oh, all these numbers.
It is a bit different. So, yeah, it's interesting. But it is important. So in the early days, it's more just control your weights. Don't be swinging around. Be a little bit slower on the eccentric versus the concentric. But as you get into more the intermediate advanced, this is where you might think, oh, that sounds a bit tedious if you're watching this as a beginner. But it does make a difference over time. And
just to put into perspective as well, where I said where some positions you'll actually like start further on down the tempo line is a leg curl. So when you're in a seated leg curl, your leg is already extended before you actually start. So because when you start the movement, you're starting at a shortened range, it means that you would start reading your tempo from the third number in. So that would be just the way to show it with a different exercise where sometimes it's not in order, let's say.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk about length and partials.
Okay.
Just be based on the new literature, but I want to save that to the end. We talked last time a little bit about range of motion and form. So this is critical. So once again, going through the largest range of motion that you can, unless you are doing something like a lengthened or a shortened partial, which now we know maybe only the lengthened partial, but generally, again, beginner, intermediate, most of you should be going through the fullest range on each movement you can. Yes. No half repping, okay? Although if we look at lengthened partials, there is a portion of the rep which is more advantageous, but as a beginner, do full repetitions. Don't leave anything on the table. And controlling throughout, right? Using that tempo, not using momentum, not bouncing on it, okay, specifically. And then RP and RAR, and we sort of rounded out. So very quickly, RPE stands for rated perceived exertion. So it's your perception of how hard your exertion is on that exercise on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is the hardest thing, it's failure. Okay, and 1 is super easy, 5 somewhere in the middle. Generally, we want to be training between a 7 and a 9 RPE. We never want to go to true failure. And again, we talked about this last time. What predicates that is the execution, the form, the skill, and usually the experience to be able to do so. But this is a moving goalpost because you will be able to train at a higher RPE over time, but your RPE is changing because you're becoming more skillful. So what was once your 6 RPE now may become your 3 RPE, so you have to increase the load to get it back to that 7.
That's where progression overload comes into account as well.
Correct. We've also got to look at the opposite to RPE. Ironically, a more advanced concept, and I say ironically because people find it easier, which is RIR, it's reps in reserve, which means how many reps would you have left over on a set. So if you do a set of hack squats, you're doing 8 to 10 with 100 kilos, you finish on 10 reps, and your coach asks you, well, you ask yourself, how many more reps could I have done with good form? Good form is key. Oh, I think maybe 3. And I go, okay, well, what's the RPE? And you say 9. Well, it doesn't match up because 3 and 9 don't equal 10. It would have had to be a 7 RPE and a 3 rep in reserve. So sometimes asking the opposite question, RIR being the opposite of RPE, can help you gauge in the early days, because a lot of people go, I don't really know. It sounds like a trick question, but you do your best. So sometimes the RPE is harder. And if you think, well, how many reps could I have done more? Oh, it would have been 2 or 3. And we could talk more about, well, if you want to test that theory, maybe do 1 or 2 more. You can start on safer movements like isolations and machines to do so. Do you want to note something on that before I crack on?
Yeah, the only thing really is that if you're, because on a lot of programs as well, like, I coach more RIR than RPE. I think you coach more RPE, or are you now more RIR?
More reps in reserve. I explained both, and usually RIR is a better gauge for most people.
Definitely, yeah. That's exactly what I was going to go with, is that if you've got two people doing the exact same program, but one is RIR, one is RPE, I've found coaching on the floor that people tend to get quite confused with RPE and with the rate. So whereas, with RIR, so reps in reserve, it's easier for them after they've done the session, done an exercise, a set, just go, oh, yep, I easily had two or 3 in the tank. So I find as well that coaching RIR is a lot more effective than RPE, and same with people, as I was just jumping on before, in regards to reading programs. Reading programs with RIR resonates with people a lot more than RPE. That's just my personal, what I've had with clients.
No, that is very true. It's very true.
Even though it's kind of the same concept when you're reading it, really.
It really should derive the same result.
Yeah.
But it's more about just understanding both, because it's just a gauge and a metric.
Yeah.
Is it Mr. Touche who come up with that? But anyway, it's very it's a very important concept, which helps us gauge if we're training at the right intensity, because otherwise it's kind of like your clock in everyday living. If you don't have a timer, you can't guess where you're going to be at 1 o'clock if you don't know where 1 o'clock is. So it's a reference, it's a calibration tool. Exactly. And that's what RP is. I say to my clients, it's like a North Star. Wherever you go in the world, you always know if you're training within that RP proximity or that RIR. You're in the ballpark.
And with RPE is always 1 out of 10. So 10 being it's like excruciating, like true, like failure, and 1 being super bloody easy. So when you're thinking about RPE, it's more about how you felt in your training, like in that set, let's say. And whereas with RIR, it's not really, it's not on a scale. It's just, I could have done 2 more in the tank. Or if we go, look, want you to train your set is 10 to 12, but we want you to keep 2 reps in reserve. So with a 2 RIR, it's a lot more effective that way, rather than trying to go, 10 to 12, we're pushing for an 8 reps in reserve, because people then overthink it as well.
Yeah, we often do, that's for sure.
Yeah.
All right, last thing quickly, lengthened partials. So what is this? It means doing a partial rep in the lengthened phase. So if we're to split, and again, I'm doing a bicep curl for those of you listening, I'm going to bring my arm down so it's in the straightened, the lengthened position. It would be doing that first portion, or that last portion, I should say. So we're thinking about, from my fist being in the straight position in my leg, coming all the way up into a 90-degree position, and then down again. That would be a lengthened partial. So it's in that lengthened phase, doing a partial or a half rep. So that we now know, based on the latest literature, and it's always evolving, that can derive just as much adaptation, muscle tissue growth, if you will, as doing a full range. Now, it wasn't conclusive that full range was better than lengthened partial, and it wasn't the other way. There was slight skewed data. But ultimately, your best, safest bet would be to do full range, especially if you're a beginner. But where this can come in handy is if when you're in a fatigue state at the end, if you can't complete a full rep on a bicep curl, or say, for example, even if it was a squat, or it would be more likely in an isolation, so say like a lying leg curl, you were cramping at the top, you could just do that length and range in a controllable fashion, and you could probably achieve more volume, and you could create that damage and get a few more reps out. But you couldn't do full reps, but you could get partial reps. So it's a way of kind of bridging the gap and inducing more hypertrophy without necessarily going through that full range or worrying that you have to do that and not robbing yourself of any extra gains. So again, something that's a bit more advanced, but something that you can add in if you're more intermediate advanced when you're starting to fail at the end of your isolation exercises.
The only thing that I'm going to just jump on with that is not that I'm for or against partials. I think that they definitely have their moment to shine, as long as they are being performed correctly. That is the biggest thing, because when I do see people training in the gym and doing partials, that's usually when they're doing weights way too heavy that they actually can't, and doing a bicep curl, they're actually swinging the weight up just to the partial. So really, you're not really doing much at all, because it's got your shoulders, your back into it, rather than just doing the partial movement. Whereas if they were doing a full range movement, they would intentionally be bringing the weight down and actually doing the movement correctly, and again with tempo as well. So not that I'm, for or against. I think that definitely has its purpose, but I think that a lot of people don't really necessarily understand how we use partial. Yeah,
it's a bit of a it's sort of tempting people to just swing weights.
Exactly.
Sadly, and this is why it's more advanced specifically, and you have to understand the nuance of it, because you're right, it's a really good point. A lot of people are just trying to do the sort of negative training where someone, you see a bunch of lads on a bench press and, they're just heaving it up, and then that person's trying to control it down, but there's not really a lot going on, and if anything, it's just dangerous because that person's using too much load. So again, control your weights, quality over quantity, and with quality comes quantity.
Exactly.
So to wrap up, we talked about tempo, time under tension, so tension versus force. We talked about eccentric versus concentric contractions. We talked about range of motion, RPE and RIR models. You explained tempo and some of the examples of tempo and how to read and interpret that. And then we finished off with some length and partial and current literature. Now, of course, things are going to evolve. The fundamentals are always the same, guys. So you got to remember the basics are the best. So when we're talking about these more nuanced things, again, it's all about context. Okay, these are tools. And that's why we've talked about this in hierarchical order. So as ever, we will put the notes, below in the show notes, wherever you're watching and listening. And if you are listening, please share and subscribe for more. If you're watching on YouTube, please give it a like if you enjoyed it, if you found it valuable. Comment if you got something positive or if you've got a question, and subscribe for more. Aside from that, anything else?
All I was going to say as well is, if you are a part of our community, make sure that you do hit complete as well on all of these lectures, that we do know that you have gone through them as well, because they are so important to progressing, especially in the gym, but also outside of the gym. So if you're a part of our community,
if you're watching on school,
then definitely hit complete. And if you want to be a part of our community, reach out and we will show you where to go.
Until the next time, stay fearless.